All right, the potter's wheel. Centering is essential. It is what allows us to make even pieces. I need a towel or rag, a sponge, a cutoff wire, a needle tool, and a ball of clay that's, I don't know, softball size or large orange, and a bucket of water. I want a good amount of water. And we use a bat in our studio. This allows us to switch out things pretty quickly. So I want to line up these holes with the bat pins. If I have a bat where I cannot see the holes, I would line up my fingers and kind of use them to feel where that goes. Make sure it's secure. All right, now I have my ball of clay. And I want to make sure it's round, right? And then add just a little bit of water to my bat. I do not want it too slick or my clay will just slide off. So I just put a little on and almost scrape a little off so it's just damp and sort of tacky. Now I'm going to make sure that my clay is getting secure by using dry hands and patting in this downward and sort of inward pressure. So it's kind of locking it on here. I kind of can use the heels of my hands or even my fingers to just sort of press down and seal it on. But the key thing is this downward pressure. This also helps me get it centered because I'm already sort of patting it into position. And that also helps me continue to get that mounded shape. So I'm going to speed up my wheel at this point and add some water. Water is really important because it creates a barrier or reduces the friction between my hand and the clay. So I'm going to continue to go back to my water over and over during this video. So I'm using my hands, the sides and kind of meat of my hands to center to get started. I'm going to start with this downward force. This is going to seal it onto the bat further. So I like to lock my thumbs to help keep my hands steady, and my elbows are against my sides. You can't see that, but that's really critical. No chicken wings here. So you notice I just grabbed some water. If I only showed just my top hand, I'm right-handed and I'm using my right hand here, you can see it flattens out the clay. So my left hand is going to balance that by pressing inward. So it's this combination of down and in at the same time. And if I only press with my left hand on the side, you can see how it presses the clay upward, right? Now, if I did these things independently, it wouldn't get centered because it would continue to be uneven. Oh, also, don't let your hand, your left hand, actually touch the bat. It will really grind your hand and it doesn't feel good. Just let it hover. All right, so here I am. I want to do my next step, which is called coning. That's where I like to link my fingers and use the heels of my hands. There are infinite ways to throw, and so I'm just showing you how I do it and what tends to work pretty well for many different people. Doesn't mean that this is the only way. So coning, you can see I'm sort of tucking my hands, kind of the bottom edge, and bringing them up, right? And you can see from the clay where I'm putting this pressure, right? There's not a lot of clay on the top parts of my hands, meaning I'm not putting pressure there. So squeezing and bringing up. And so I just kind of keep my hands open so you can see that happen here. And again, add water. If it feels sticky, if things are sticking, you do not have enough water. I might get a little bit of a divot here, so when I press back down, that's the next step here, to bring the cone down, I want to sort of angle it. And again, my top hand is doing the downward pressure, my left hand on the side is doing that side pressure to keep things balanced. So I'm, working together here. And I like to kind of keep my hand actually at an angle. So I really use my wrist as a pivot point so that I'm actually using sort of the pinky, like the knuckle of my pinky to press down right through that middle. And so centering often is a repetition of coning and then bringing it back down. And my cone is a cone, right? It is not a straight piece. It has a taper to it. And it's not super tall. It does depend on how much clay you have. So for this ball of clay, it's I don't know, maybe 4 inches max in height. So now I'm gonna press back down. Our goal is to get something centered, meaning that it's not unevenly wobbling, and to get sort of this mound of clay. There's not like a precise or perfect shape other than centered, but it could be slightly flatter, slightly taller. This sort of depends on ultimately what you end up making. A plate would be wider, a bowl or a cup would be taller. And so this last bit of centering often is just kind of sitting and holding it, right? Ta-da! Now, if you take your hands off too quickly, I'm going to surprise my clay and make it off center. So please be gentle, don't surprise it, and gently remove your hands when you're ready to see where you're at. Also remove your hands before you stop the wheel. Now, one way you can sort of try and tell it fits center is with a needle tool or other sharp tool to gently introduce it to my clay and just let it make some lines. I'm not forcing it, it's just barely touching, and then I let it hover, and it should be evenly distributed, and that would be one way I could tell it was center. All right, here's the same thing, but from the side. All right, so I've got my clay, and I'm going to start with this downward pressure. All right, so I'm pressing it down, and notice my hands and my arms are fairly tense, right? I am applying pressure, but don't do something that is uncomfortable or hurts, because it is important that we practice like what feels good, so that we're not going to create bad habits that are going to be long-term, could add some stress, right? So you can see here how I'm hovering my hand, the heel of my hand, on the bat. It's not actually dragging on there, because again, that will hurt. And I'm pressing down and over, and you can really notice the clay changing shape. If something's not working, just try something a little bit different. We're learning here. We're learning what happens when we do something. So here's coning. So heels of my hands are sort of, pulling into each other. And notice it's uneven on the top. That is on purpose, because now I can start to even it out. Coning helps me bring that unevenness towards the top, and then allows me to press it back down into my hands. So you can really start to see it taking shape here. So sides and heels of my hands, kind of tucked and pulling. Don't tuck and squeeze too hard, or you're just going to rip the thing off, right? The key thing is that, most of our muscle and ability to manipulate the clay comes from these like meatier parts, not so much our fingers at this stage. These are fingers more for the refining stages later on. So you can see that becoming a cone, and then I'm going to press it back down, and you can really see like the side of my hand getting pressed into the clay because I'm pushing on there, and see how I can pivot and press at a slight angle, so I get instead of a flattened piece, a more rounded piece. And see how if I only press with the top, how it really will unbalance. And I'm not rushing this, right? And again, my elbows are really locked into my sides. The point of learning to center, it takes a lot of practice, because we're developing muscle memory, and we need to develop good muscle memory, right? We don't want to develop bad habits that make it harder to center in the long run. So be patient with yourself, and make sure you take the time to practice, right? Because ultimately, if you can't center and you go to the next step, it's not going to work. You're going to have to end up centering again and again and again. And so getting kind of this basic technique down really serves you well. All right, so you can see how I can bend my wrist, and that actually rounds out my piece. If I just held my hand really at a rigid top angle, I'm going to get a flatter piece. And here you can see I can get a much nicer rounded shape, which generally lends itself well to our next steps in terms of throwing. Now I do have my left wrist at an angle, but make sure you're not overextending it, so that again you're stressing those tendons. It is very easy to create repetitive stress on your muscles and your tendons on the wheel. So be careful about, again, if something feels uncomfortable, that's something to pay attention to, and think about a different adjustment and way of throwing. So I just used a card there to scrape away some excess clay, which I will do before I get to some finishing touches. All right, so this is centered. So again, I can use my needle tool, and I can gently let it touch, and I'm not forcing it, because otherwise you won't get proper feedback, to create these lines that tell me if it's centered. And notice I'm doing it in multiple spots. It needs to be centered all over.